So here we are, chaos or civilization, and uh, I believe this is page 151. I'll just repeat this
Okay.
last paragraph we read. There are two states of consciousness in man: the finite and the infinite. The infinite state is only achieved when man has completed his journey through the seven planes or spheres of consciousness. The final or seventh plane can only be accomplished through the help of a perfect master. You must always be borne in mind that the first six planes of the path are an illusory pilgrimage within Maya or creation. Only when the seventh plane has been reached does the aspirant have a real awakening into truth consciousness. And only a perfect master can awaken the seeker from his dream state of Maya and initiate him into the realm of actual reality, which, as we know, is the only real self realization or godhood. When a master needs his disciple for daily activities, he will draw him along across the path unconsciously, as if under a veil, through the different stages of the various planes of spiritual existence. It is useless to try to explain what is inexplicable, since no intellectual explanation of the mystery of life, death, and Maya is possible. Only when a man has been fully awakened will he know the lahar within the absolute and the boss of manifestation. And I believe boss means ignorance. The longing for man to be reunited with his source may be conscious or unconscious according to the number of his lives. But in some life or other, the urge to find his real self will be so strong as to predominate over all other desires. This urge will bring him to the path which leads to his goal. Owing to the operation of the spiritual laws pertaining to the transformation and emancipation of consciousness from Maya, the spiritual progress of the aspirant, once he has entered the path, is more or less unconscious. That is to say, it is the same as with a child who is not conscious of the growth and development of his body towards manhood. Thus, the process of self knowledge to the ultimate full self realization is a gradual, unconscious progress in the ultimate liberation from Maya. A study of the intricacies of the path towards self realization shows that men, on reaching a certain stage, may believe themselves to have reached the ultimate goal. For under the influence of Maya, the path itself can give rise to many deceptions. Thus, men can delude themselves and others into believing they possess spiritual claims far in advance of their actual attainment. In this manner, semi advanced pilgrims on the way, and also the yogis, can and do see truth, as the master says, through multicolored glasses. Whereas the Sadgurus and avatars need no glasses at all because they are already truth incarnate. It is almost impossible to explain why the aspirant should be trapped into self delusion, except to say that there are such infinite distances between the planes. Although the consciousness of the aspirant is the same, it is no longer unfolding, as was the case in the earlier intermediate stages on the different planes. Ergo, the difference on each plane has become so sharp and well defined that there can be no point of fusion from one plane to another as had existed before. So we can see that the spiritual pilgrim who does not come under the protection and direct guidance of a perfect master might easily believe that he has reached the ultimate goal, whereas he may be nowhere near its termination. As for the final stage, the seventh plane, Meher Baba has said that the gulf is so great that the difference in the state of consciousness or awareness might be likened to the difference between the consciousness of an ant and that of a human being. If we appreciate these most important distinctions, then it becomes easier to understand why there are so many claimants today to the greatest of all spiritual initiations into the life of God. It should be remembered that the great difference between a perfected man and others is that he alone can possess the gift of perfection on others. Sorry, can bestow. He alone can bestow the gift of perfection on others. Only he can give self realization and full God consciousness. It is impossible to go into lengthy descriptions of the initiations, but a short description of the different stages of the path can best be described in Meher Baba's discourses. Quote, after entering a new plane of consciousness, a person usually takes some time before he can freely function on that plane. As there is a radical change in the total conditions of mental life, the person experiences a sort of paralysis of mental activity, which is known as samadhi. When the pilgrim enters a new plane, he merges into that plane before he can experience the state which is characteristic of that plane. Just as a pilgrim who is tired by the strain of the journey sometimes goes to sleep, consciousness which has made the effort of ascending to a new plane goes through a period of lowered mental activity comparable to sleep. At the same time, however, the samadhi is fundamentally different from sleep because in sleep a person is totally unconscious, whereas in samadhi he is conscious of bliss, light, or power, although he is unconscious of his body or surroundings. After a period of comparative stillness, the mind begins to function on the new plane and experiences a state of consciousness which is utterly different from the state it has left behind. When the aspirant enters a new plane, he gets merged into it, and along with the lowering of mental activity, he experiences a substantial diminution in his ego life. This curtailment of the ego life is different from the final annihilation of the ego, which takes place on the seventh plane. But like the final annihilation at the seventh plane, the different stages of the curtailment of the ego at the intermediate six planes deserve special mention owing to their relative importance. In the Sufi spiritual tradition, the final annihilation of the ego is described as fana phila, and the earlier samadhis of the six planes of duality have also been recognized as kinds of fana, since they also involve a partial annihilation of the ego. Through all these fanas of ascending order, there is the continuity of progression towards the final fana phila, and each of them has some special characteristic. When the pilgrim arrives at the first plane, he experiences his first merging of fana. which consists of the minor annihilation of the ego. The pilgrim is temporarily lost to his limited individuality and experiences bliss. Many pilgrims who thus get merged in the first plane think they have realized God and get caught up in the first plane. But if the pilgrim keeps himself free from self-delusion, or comes to realize that this attainment is really a transitional phase in his journey, he advances further on the spiritual path and arrives at the second plane. Miriam, could you unmute, please, and continue?
Yes. The merging into the second plane is called Phana or the annihilation of the false. The pilgrim is now absorbed in bliss and infinite light. Some think they have reached the goal and get stranded in the second plane, but others who keep themselves free from self-delusions march onwards and enter the third plane.
I think we've lost Marianne. Till she comes back, I'll continue reading. The merging into the second plane is called Fan Abatili, or the annihilation of the false. The pilgrim is now absorbed in bliss and infinite light. Some think they have reached the goal and get stranded in the second plane, but others who keep themselves free from self-delusions march onwards and enter the third plane. The merging into the third plane is called Fana Zahiri, or Zahiri, or the annihilation of the apparent. Here the pilgrim loses for days all consciousness of the body or the world and experiences infinite power. But since he has no consciousness of the world, he has no occasion for the expression of his powers. This is called Videha Samadhi, or the state of divine coma. Consciousness is now completely withdrawn from the entire world. So I finished that paragraph for you, Marianne.
Thank you. There was a power surge cut out here. Okay. If the pilgrim, is that where I begin?
Yes, please.
If the pilgrim advances still further, he arrives at the fourth plane. The merging into the fourth plane is called Fana Malakuti, or the annihilation leading towards freedom. The pilgrim experiences a peculiar state of consciousness at the fourth plane, since he now not only feels infinite power, but also has plenty of occasions for the expression of that power. He can, for example, know what anyone situated in any part of the globe is thinking or doing. Further, he has not only occasions for the use of his powers, but has a definite inclination to express them. If he falls a prey to this temptation, he goes on expressing powers and gets caught up in the alluring possibilities of the fourth plane. The fourth plane is, for this reason, one of the most dangerous and difficult planes to cross. The pilgrim is never spiritually safe and always has the possibility of a reversion until he has successfully crossed the fourth plane and arrives at the fifth plane. The merging into the fifth plane is called Fana Jabarute, or the annihilation of all desires. Here, the incessant activity of the lower intellect comes to a standstill. He does not think in the ordinary way, and yet he is indirectly a source of many thoughts inspired in others. He sees, but not with the physical eyes. Mind speaks with mind, and there is neither worry nor doubt. He is now spiritually safe and beyond the possibility of a downfall. And yet many a pilgrim on this exalted plane finds it difficult to resist the delusion that he has attained godhood. In his self-delusion, he thinks and says, I am God, and believes himself to have arrived at the end of the spiritual path. But if he moves on, he perceives his mistake and advances to the sixth plane. The merging into the sixth plane is called Vana-i Mahal-Bodhi, or the annihilation of the self in the beloved. Now the pilgrim sees God directly and clearly, as an ordinary person sees the different things of this world. And this continued perception and enjoyment of God does not suffer a break, even for an instant. Yet he does not become one with God, the infinite. If the pilgrim ascends to the seventh plane, he experiences the last merging, which is called Vana-phila, or the annihilation of the self in God. Through this merging, the pilgrim loses his separate existence and becomes permanently united with God. He is now one with God and experiences himself as being none other than God himself. This seventh plane, Vana-phila, is the terminus of the spiritual path, the goal of all search and endeavor. It is the Sahaj Samadhi, or the Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is the characteristic of conscious godhood. It is the only real awakening. The pilgrim has now reached the other shore of the vast ocean of imagination and realizes that this last truth is the only truth, and that all the other stages on the path were entirely illusory. He has arrived at the final destination. Asterisk, for more detailed account of the various stages, see Meher Baba, his philosophy and teachings, revised and enlarged by Dr. A.J. Munsif. Chapter 9, The Musts. India is a strange country full of startling anomalies. One can but be impressed with the grandeur of her hoary civilizations, as seen in her monuments, temples, and history. But her deformed beggars, her lepers, her emaciated peoples, her neglected and ill-treated animals, religious taboos allow them to die slowly in great pain, make a sad sight. The sensitive Westerner is appalled by the raw brutality of life and by the spawning millions of humanity for whom there is no future. Until the education and emancipation of women takes place, it is difficult to see where real progress can begin. Then again, the dirt and the dust. Yet nowhere in the world does one meet with such sensitive and beautiful souls, heirs to all the ages. One feels they had a spiritual heritage when we went about in woad and skins. No country in the world has such an unequal distribution of wealth. The
Oh,
very,
Mariana, could I just interject?
yes.
Woad, I looked it up, and it's the blue dye that um, uh,
Oh,
Britons used to dye their skin with, evidently, back in
that's
the,
what it is.
that is, yeah.
That blue dye.
Yeah, it comes from a, a member of the mustard family.
Is that what Krishna, the paintings of Krishna often have blue skin? I don't know.
That I don't know either, but no, I'm talking about she's talking about the British. I
Oh, the
guess.
British. Well, thank you. That
Yeah.
clarifies that word. Thank you.
You're welcome.
No country in the world has such an unequal distribution of wealth, the very rich and the very poor. A wealthy person can, if he chooses, eat like a glutton while famine stalks the land. The Mahars, known to us as the untouchables, are a standing example of man's inhumanity to man. These people are a downtrodden, despised, rejected, and neglected people of some 50 million or more. It is true that some legislation has been passed to make their condition a little more tolerable, so that they may travel in public transportation and not be kept as entirely isolated as before, but it will be many years, if not generations, before they become accepted as part of India's present-day so-called democracy, unless the expected push in spiritual consciousness affects the unadvanced peasant class and village folk, who are still much more intolerant than the townsfolk. India's bloodbath to celebrate her independence and the partition in 1947 shocked the civilized world, who did not realize the lack of religious tolerance or the fanaticism of the different sects. It is the religious differences which are the curse of India and which help to create the tremendous political differences which rend the country in twain and complicate still more the problem of bringing India and Pakistan into the comity of civilized nations. The standards of ancient Indian literature are too far removed from those of Western culture to be appreciated by foreigners, except for the Vedas and the Upanishads. What is more sublime than the Bhagavad Gita? Let those who indiscriminately condemn Hinduism for its faults study the Gita before they presume to draw comparisons with Christianity. But writings in general are overloaded with repetitious didactic material, and the original legends and myths are impossible to disentangle from the 220,000 lines of the Mahabharata, the 96,000 lines of the Ramayana, and other great epics, which were the work of generations of poets, the esoteric teachings of which are hidden under double meanings and obscurities, which could hardly be unraveled by any but initiates. The Sanskrit language, the key to past Indian culture, is unfortunately already beginning to be neglected under the impact of Western influence. Travelers in India are more struck by the superstition of its various peoples than by their spirituality. Take, for example, the holy lake of Pushkar, where multitudes of pilgrims go every year to bathe, believing they will leave their sins behind as they often leave their legs and arms in its crocodile-infested waters. It is only the Himalayas, in their immensity of untrodden snows, that give one the feeling of the infinite, the eternal. Yet despite India's sins, her hidebound traditions, her cruel caste distinctions, her inability to accomplish much without the aid of bakshish, she remains the most spiritual country in the world. Why? The master's explanation is because India is nearest to creation point, the one tiny point from which generated the expanding universe. For this reason, there are more lovers of God in India than anywhere else in the world. The explanation of this curious fact is that India retains so much spiritual energy. This God essence, as it might be called, is more apparent in India than in any other country. But needless to say, amongst these holy men, there are many who find religious hypocrisy an easy way to earn a living. For the peasants are apt to think it's safer to please rather than to displease them. The aspirants to God range in varying degrees, from the sadhu in his saffron robe to the great muktas and majjubs of the seventh plane. The most unusual of all these pilgrims on the path are the musts. The Westerner who is interested in the real or secret India has heard vaguely of these peculiar beings, the God-mad, the God-intoxicated. God gives out his love to mankind in diverse ways. His expression needs the purest channels, and what purer channels are there than the great musts? For they, having lost their egos in their love for God, have transcended the limitation of the flesh. During his ascent into God consciousness, a must has, in his contemplation of eternal being, become oblivious of the phenomenal world of forms, which, for him, has become but the domain of Maya. The spirit, having risen so high, becomes free from its bondage of the flesh and deigns not to descend again to the valley of shadows, the physical plane. In such an instance, the body of the aspirant takes on the appearance of a madman or a peculiar person. These musts might be described as human dynamos of what can only be called God essence. Here, we will digress for a moment to ask, what is God essence? The dictionary definition of spirit tells us that spirit is life or intelligence conceived of as entirely apart from physical embodiment. It is vital essence, force, energy, as distinct from matter. As we know, God manifests himself in various forms of energy, and space is full of forces about which science knows nothing. But undoubtedly, one of the main forces is electricity. No scientist has been able to answer the question, quote, what is electricity and what is its relation to other forces? End quote. We are told that human beings are composed of electrical and chemical units. There's a footnote, Lakovsky's and Crilley's theories. See appendix. The researches of the late Dr. Kilner of St. Thomas Hospital have demonstrated that the aura of man is an emanation of an electromagnetic character. Scientific opinion states that man is a mechanism composed of electrical and chemical reactions, a machine made up of 28 trillion electric cells. If we look at the human being from the standpoint of physics, it should be easier to appreciate the musts as being, in some manner, channels for the higher potential of a spiritual force in some way resembling electrical energy. The fact that sometimes the Mandali, disciples of the master, when near the musts, have actually experienced sensations analogous to electrical shocks, emphasizes this contention. There is no doubt that the must, who has attained to the higher spheres, has entered the region which is the domain of energy. Matter being a solidification of energy, it follows that when a man has transcended the physical form of energy and entered into the realm of spirit energy, he enters into a state in which his consciousness consists of vibrating spiritual energy. His entire life is contained in this energy, and he becomes a powerful organ for the production of energy. We presume it is this force which is utilized by the master for his universal work on humanity. For the must, who is entirely absorbed in and concentrated on God, becomes a perfect channel to which the master can work, since he has become a medium of God. A must, because his mind is entirely absorbed in his inner spiritual experiences, can very easily get excited and even dangerous if his divine contemplation of divinity is disturbed. His condition makes him impervious to his surroundings. His body is left to a mechanical control and maintenance, whereas the main preoccupation in the life of a normal man is the care of his body. As the must is so closely linked with the spiritual life of humanity, the book, The Wayfarers, to which we have already referred, is of great importance to the psychiatrist and psychologist. It reveals knowledge never before given to the West and is a very remarkable commentary on the behavior of these extraordinary individuals who are indeed unconscious saints of a higher order. So footnote. Here we feel it not inappropriate to refer to the researches of Charles Lancelin. See appendix.
I could take a turn now, Marion, for a few minutes. With regard to the mentality of musts, it is necessary to quote at length from the above mentioned book, the author of which is an English medical man. Quote, the derangement of the musts differs from that of ordinary mad persons, both in its origin and nature. The latter lose their mental balance through disintegrating physiological and psychic causes of an ordinary kind. In the physiological field, disease of some sort is the cause. while in the mental field, acute and apparently insoluble conflict between deep rooted instincts and man's conventional codes is the source of madness. In the case of the musts, their state of unbalance is induced by their powerful urge to realize God. As the spiritual aspirant advances in his all consuming desire to experience God, the mental structure with its normal tendencies and capacities is dissolved. The successful termination of this urge initiates the aspirant into the supramental state of perfect integration and direct realization of the Supreme Self. Naturally, the methods of treatment of the ordinary insane person and the God mad will differ. In the case of the former, the usual method consists in counteracting whatever physical causes may have contributed to the derangement. If a psychic origin is also involved, expert analysis helps to bring to the surface of consciousness the deep rooted conflicts and complexes which have led to the mental breakdown. Unfortunately, the average analyst cannot give the patient the power to solve these problems, though the analyst may exercise the utmost patience, gentleness, and understanding. Unless he has the capacity to arouse the latent spiritual powers of the patient, no cure is possible. It naturally follows that the ordinary analyst, who has little insight into spiritual realities, could hardly be expected to help the God mad, whose experiences and objectives are entirely beyond range of his own experience or even his imagination. Only a supreme master of consciousness can give them the help that they so greatly need. With his discernment, he is able to appreciate both their spiritual yearnings and their peculiar individual obstacles. And through the exercise of his spiritual powers, he can advance them towards their goal or bring them back to three-dimensional consciousness as their case requires. During the process of transcending the mind, the aspirant is subjected to so much disturbance that he is unable to use his mind in the normal way and to all appearances behaves like a madman. But the master, who has direct insight into the workings of the mind, knows the true cause and nature of the must's peculiar mental condition. He knows precisely what mental motivation has induced this state of unbalance and is therefore able to help the must to attain the goal in his own particular way. With such help, the spiritually dazed eventually emerge into a supramental state of perfect integration and harmony. The appearance of balance, which the ordinary man possesses, is only provisional and is due to his ability to strike a compromise between the warring elements of his psyche and his environment. However, in order that the mind may achieve a true balance, the provisional balance has to be considerably disturbed. When this happens without the supervision of a perfect master, a condition of apparent madness results. These extraordinary creatures, the musks, mad and with the appearance of beggars, are often quite incapable of taking care of themselves, that is to say, of their bodies, being oblivious and indifferent to all material considerations. Their bodies and surroundings can be indescribably filthy. They sometimes have very peculiar appetites. Some eat garbage, and others drink out of drains. Yet, although they may live in the most insanitary surroundings, they remain perfectly healthy. There is one must mentioned in this book whose diet consisted chiefly of dry bread, powdered stone, and wood. The musks can live under all climatic conditions, being quite insensible to burning heat or bitter cold. They can sit in the snow or rain with perfect equanimity, being impervious to all physical discomforts. This is analogous to the state of ordinary insane persons who at times appear to be quite insensible to changes of temperature. They must draw their vitality direct from the essence of God. This causes them to be immune from normal physical reactions. Their ego, having soared to the higher spheres of existence, in their intoxication, they ignore the flesh. Mayor Baba once said, mind stopped is God, mind working is man. Man slowed down is must. Mind working fast is mad. The yogis who are sane and well balanced men can show a similar indifference to the discomforts of the flesh, but they have to undergo a lifelong training with special breathing exercise, mental and physical practices, and exercises of the will and imagination. Such ascetics have sometimes been seen by travelers sitting naked on the snowy slopes of the Himalayas. But for that matter, during the summer of 1952, there were photographs in the London newspapers of an ascetic sitting naked in Hyde Park in extremely rigorous weather. But nevertheless, the yogis do not reach the same high planes of consciousness as the great musts. Marianne, could you unmute and continue, please?
In the West, we have in the West, we have a fair proportion of religious maniacs in the asylums, but they have no spiritual status comparable with that of the musks, who are only to be found in the East. Footnote. It might be safe to assume that some of the Christian anchorites and hermits who lived in the Near East at the beginning of the Christian era might have been musks. Saint Simon Stylites sitting Saint Simon Stylites sitting on top of his pole for 20 years might have been a must-like personality. Egotism and megalomania in some cases, no doubt, partly contributed to some breakdowns in the West, as unfortunately in religious matters, there is always scope for arrogance and desire for domination. There are, however, no known Western traditions about God-intoxicated souls. It is certainly very hard for the Westerner to understand how such a being as a must can be nearer to God than a normal, intelligent, and good man. Meher Baba has explained this mystery as follows, quote, standards of good and bad are established according to contemporary standards that may vary with time and circumstances. In spirituality, very often what is understood to be good by the masses is, from the spiritual point of view, bad. And what is understood as bad by the masses is often good from the spiritual point of view. For example, robbery is bad by general standards, but if one robs to help some starving mother who has just given birth to a child, it is good. Also, by general standards, beating others is bad. But if you beat someone with the motive of correcting his life and do so without malice and without anger, this beating is a blessed virtue. From general standards of society, religion, health, morality, and so forth, cleanliness of body and mind are indispensable. It is very easy to keep the body clean, but cleanliness of the mind is very difficult indeed. The more one gets attached to body cleanliness for merely selfish reasons, the less are the chances of having a clean mind. If, however, one is given up wholly to mental cleanliness, which means becoming free from low, selfish, impure desires and thoughts of lust, greed, anger, backbiting, etc., the less is one's mind attached to bodily needs and bodily cleanliness. All this applies to ordinary persons. Close quote. Now, of the 5 types, God merged, God intoxicated, God absorbed, God communed, and God mad, the God absorbed and God communed can, more or less, keep their bodies cleaned. Their minds are almost automatically clean, owing to their being absorbed in God or in communion with God. But the God mad, the God intoxicated, and the God merged all invariably have dirty bodies, live in dirty surroundings, and may have dirty physical habits. A God mad man has a clean, pure mind. A God intoxicated man has a mind, but no thoughts, for his mind is simply enjoying the intoxicated state. A God merged has also no mind. He is fully merged in God. So in these 3 cases, their mental cleanliness and purity cannot be questioned. Now, why should their bodies and environment be dirty? You will find that the majority of ordinary mad people have very little consciousness of their bodies. So if an ordinary mind, when mad, does not pay attention to bodily cleanliness, then the 3 types of God men who, unconsciously, know all the universe to be zero, body to be shadow, and whose minds are absolutely unattached to the body, cannot be expected to keep their bodies and surroundings clean. This is continuing the original quote. When the mind does not pay attention to the body naturally automatically survives and looks after itself. Now, because of a kind of universal working on the gross plane, a sort of automatic attraction takes place, which causes the man who is indifferent to cleanliness to be attracted to place himself in dirty surroundings. He does not purposely choose an unclean place, but tends to gravitate towards it, for he is himself quite indifferent either to cleanliness or to dirt on the physical plane. For those who are God mad, God intoxicated, or God merged, this dirtiness does not affect their health because the mind is not attached to the body. For these souls, good or bad, cleanliness or dirt, a palace or a hut, a spotless avenue or a filthy gutter, are all the same, and they are driven into any of these places according to circumstances. It is natural for a must to have a dirty body, and it is natural for him to be driven into dirty surroundings. But if the devotee of a must happens to give him comfort and cleanliness, he takes it because it is forced on him, but he is quite indifferent to it. In these three types also, greed, anger, avarice, and lust do not exist, since the minds of the God mad and God intoxicated are always turned towards God, as the God merged have no minds. Their bodily actions are not under their control. They are indifferent to everything, so that their actions are either indifferently controlled or are controlled by God. Whatever they do, whether it be called good or bad from worldly standards, it has no selfish motive or personal deliberation. So if these persons laugh or cry, seem happy or morose, caress others or beat them, they are not conscious of what they do or of how they behave. Nevertheless, their doing acts in anger helps those on whom this unconscious anger is spent, because their selfless anger destroys the anger sanskaras of the recipient. In ordinary circumstances, if A gets angry with and beats B, B's red sanskaras of anger become attached to A. A loses and B gains. If B also gets angry and beats A, then both are equal. If a must hits either A or B, their sanskaras of anger are destroyed. But these sanskaras do not recoil must. But if either A or B hits the must, it is a terrible binding.
Thanks, Marion. Gloria and Miguel have arrived. We'll just let you guys know that we now start at 6. But since you're here, why don't you each take a turn reading for like 5 minutes each? Go ahead, Gloria.
Thank you. Thank you. Quote, and now why does one must become a Jalali, another a Jamali, another a Mahbubi, and so forth? Everyone has to pass through innumerable lives. If one man who in his past life lived in an environment of strife and great activity becomes in this life a mast, he is of the Jalali type. If another who led his past life in a quiet village or was perhaps in a dull and idle environment becomes in this life a mast, he is of the Jamali type. If a man who in his previous life was a bachelor or may not have committed the sexual act becomes in this life a must, he is of the Mahbubi type. That is because the sanskaras of love for women were unexpressed in his past life, and in this woman's dress or in acting in some way like a woman. And
You skipped a line, my dear.
sorry.
From here.
That is because the sanskaras of love for women were unexpressed in his past life, and in this life they find expression in the wearing of some part of a woman's dress, or in acting in some ways like a woman. Quote ends. It is known that Ramakrishna, during one phase of his life, wore women's clothes, which suggests that in his former life he had belonged to the Mahbubi type. The whole subject is handicapped by the sparse vocabulary in English for the different states of spiritual experience, the different types of mast, and the different grades of a spiritual aspirant. So all terms applicable come from Sufi or Vedantic sources. The author of the Wayfarers, from which book we draw our material for this chapter, has classified under the direction of Meher Baba the various types of advanced souls in the ascending order of spiritual progress, and in the supplement to the book, a large number of masts have their stories recorded and placed in their specific categories. Some of them have made very interesting observations on the master's spiritual status. Chati Baba, a sixth plain mast of Negapatam, one of Meher Baba's favorites, said in June 1940, quote, "There will be much trouble and privation, and many will die of starvation, but Baba will assuage the suffering of the world." End quote. In March 1941, in Quetta, he said, quote, "There will be so great a calamity in the world that no one can imagine it. Even brother will kill brother, and there will be great tribulation. Then all the world will think of my big brother, Meher Baba. At that time, Baba will draw aside the veil, and all will pay obedience to him." End quote. In July 1941, he told one of Baba's Mandali, who was in a bad mood at that time, quote, "You want to live, don't you? But what's the good of it? All the world is in Baba's power, so where will you go to? Serve him now, he is the ocean, because one day when lots of people throngs to see him, you may never get the opportunity of meeting him. So take your chance now." Quote, end quote. This particular mast, though generally unconscious, is greatly revered in India by his devotees who prostrate themselves on approaching him. It is known that certain masts are called spiritual churchmen. These great masts see to the spiritual welfare of a town or city for which they are responsible on the inner planes of existence. This is peculiar to India alone, for in the West, there are the spiritual agents.
Thank you, Gloria. Miguel, take a turn, please.
Mm-hmm. The spiritual churchman of Pune is Joshi Buba, a sixth plain mast, and therefore of considerable importance to the spiritual world. I went to see him. He was sitting almost naked in a corner of one of Pune's marketplaces. I was impressed with his fine psyche and dignified bearing. He greeted my companions graciously and accepted my homage. We offered him cake and coffee, which he ate and drank with the manner of a cultured man. He had been a well-known lawyer before he became a God addict. He always sat at this same spot, surrounded by rags. The mass offered my friend one to sit on, but happily I had accommodated myself on a doorstep. I sensed the spiritual radiance which enveloped him. I could see from his face that he was in a state of concentrated preoccupation with the Holy Grail of his desire, and had attained a bliss that I could not even aspire to. Since I saw him, he has been removed to an asylum where he can be better looked after. Some of these masks are well known in the localities in which they live. They also have circles of devotees. At Delhi, there used to be a very famous mask, Hafizji Navima. This man was the spiritual chargeman of Delhi. Here we will quote verbatim from the supplement of the book mentioned above. Quote, "He was quite blind and quite naked, but despite his blindness, he would walk all over the old city of Delhi. There is a strange story in connection with his nakedness. It seems that certain influential residents of Delhi told the police that this man, walking about the streets quite naked, was indecent. So the police brought him to the police station. There he was told that he will be taken to the court and charged, and he demanded to be taken in a palanquin. Seeing he was blind and already held in some respect by many people, this request was agreed to. But when the palanquin reached the magistrate's court and its curtains were open, all they found was a stone lying on the floor of the palanquin. The police returned to the station, their ears smarting with the reprimands of their superiors, and saw out Hafizji again from the streets of Delhi. This time, they begged him to come with them to the court, since they themselves were getting into trouble because of him. So he came and appeared in court, and was duly convicted and locked in a prison cell. The same night, however, some policemen found Hafizji again free in the town, and knowing he had that day been locked up, reported the matter to the police station. Investigations show that Hafizji's cell was quite empty, though the locks on the gates of his cell were intact, closed, and apparently unattempered with. So from that day forth, the fame of Hafizji became greatly spread throughout the town, and he was allowed to move freely as and where he liked. Hafizji passed away on the 6th July 1941, and his fame was so great that reports of his death were published even in the Times of India. End quote. Those who wish to appreciate something of the extraordinary work done by Meher Baba in connection with the masks should study the supplement of the Wayfarers. It purports to be a complete record of the master's contacts with masts, salik-like pilgrims, sadhus, fakirs, and the poor, and is chiefly a record of all these thousands of contacts on his various exacting tours in India. Dr. Duncan writes as follows, quote, "The reader then has no need to drag aching and dusty feet along the 20 miles of stony built track that led to Jasgiran, where Nanga Baba sat naked on a hilltop for 25 years. He need only settle more snugly in his chair, and with a few flips of fingers and thumb, turn to Jasgiran in the supplement and descend in imagination upon that wild hill and sit with Baba, his men, and the local village folk, and in his mind's eye watch Nanga Baba devour his meal of pounded wood and stone." End quote. A new quote, "No need also to sit with aching bones, hour after weary hour, in the compressed and sweaty discomfort of an Indian third-class carriage, as Baba and his men have done, nor to work a passage along the skulking banks of rice fields to Bansi, where that ageless yogi sits like a waiting image in a darkened room. The reader need only slide the lamp a little closer, and if he reads in bed, shift his pillow to a new angle and turn over the pages to Bansi and dream himself into that strange room." End quote. New quote, "No need to have fingers pinched and clothes torn by the incalculable behavior of Tonga hoods and Tonga old hostelry, nor to suffer the battering of bullock cart journeys over interminable country tracks. For with agile fingers and a rapid eye, the reader may fly within a few minutes from Rishikesh, where Keshwanandhi stood in that mountain valley at the edge of the grey waters of the Ganges, to Kilakarai in the farthest south, where Puyukolah Baba awed the villagers by crossing rivers without swimming and without a boat. And if in turning the leaves of the supplement, one finds pages here and there with few souls of interest, one may infer how much more tedious were the hours and days of labor of Baba and his men spent in searching out these minor souls. Saints who are consciously aware of their spiritual progress are, perhaps, not so hard to find, but great masters are gems wrapped in the rubbish of an outer packing of eccentricity and physical dirtiness. And it needs the skill and vision of the master, not only to pierce the veil of trivialities, but also to separate the real jewels from plausible fakes. Dr. Duncan observes that his book possesses, quote, one irremediable defect, that it shows nothing of the invisible spiritual interplay between the consciousness of the master and the minds and souls of the inmates in the ashrams for the math. For that, we are subscribed to Baba's own statement that his relationship with Mass is a matter between him and them. So, like an iceberg, we see only the eighth part that stands above the surface of the ocean, and the submerged 7/8, the real mass of the thing, is hidden from our eyes.
Thanks, Miguel. So we'll stop here near the bottom of page 171 and continue next week. Thanks a lot.